In every high-stakes negotiation, there is an opening move, a sleight of hand designed to disarm you before you even realize the game has begun. Today, that move is linguistic. Your opponents don't argue the facts anymore. That's too crude. Instead, they rename them. They introduce a concept that sounds polite, modern, even compassionate. They call it my truth. It seduces you into thinking reality is a private club where everyone gets a membership card. But make no mistake, this is not philosophy. It is a perfect disguise for manipulation. It is a tactical shield raised to protect a weak claim from the harsh light of examination. When truth becomes personal property, the rules of engagement shift. Accuracy no longer matters. The most accurate observer loses, and the best performer wins. Power quietly transfers to the one who can shame, flatter, or confuse the room. When someone uses this phrase, you are not being invited to a dialogue. You are being recruited. The subtext is a command. Do not challenge me. Validate me. So let us do something unfashionable. Let us look at the world the way the universe does, without feelings. There are different angles, there are differing levels of information, but there are not different realities. There is only the truth. Objective, indifferent, and undefeated. If you want to survive what is coming, you don't need a script. You need the spine to stand inside it. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Now let's begin. Here's the opening move they use on you. They don't argue the facts. They rename them. They tell you there is your truth, my truth, their truth, as if reality is a private club and everyone gets a membership card. It sounds polite, it sounds modern, it sounds compassionate. It's also a perfect disguise for manipulation. Because the moment truth becomes personal property, the best performer wins, not the most accurate observer. And once accuracy stops mattering, power goes to whoever can shame, flatter, or confuse the room. So let's do something unfashionable. Let's talk about truth the way the universe talks about it, without feelings. There are different perspectives, there are different angles, there are different levels of information, but there aren't different realities. There is truth, objective, indifferent, and undefeated. And if you want to survive what's coming, you will need the spine to stand inside it. And we start with the first principle. If someone ever begins a sentence with my truth, pay attention. You're about to be recruited. The phrase isn't innocent. It's a shield, a way to protect a claim from examination, a way to say, don't challenge me, validate me. Here's the mechanism. A person makes a statement. You check it against reality. Reality disagrees. So the person changes the rules. That's your truth. This is mine. It's not philosophy. It's a tactic. Because truth, in its strictest sense, does not negotiate. It doesn't care how sincere you are. It doesn't care how loud you are. It doesn't care how many people clap. If you step off a roof, gravity doesn't ask what you identify as. It doesn't ask what your lived experience is. It simply does what it does. That's why manipulators love my truth. It turns criticism into an insult. It turns disagreement into harm. It turns fact-checking into violence. And once you accept that framework, the bullshitter is free. Because now you can't question them without being framed as an oppressor. Hold that thought. Because if you want to understand how this language took over, you have to understand where it came from and what kind of society can afford to believe it. Closer. And that brings us to the second move, how relativism became fashionable and why it always arrives in comfortable times. Relativism sells best when people feel safe. Not safe in the emotional sense, safe in the structural sense. Full shelves, strong currency, jobs that still feel real, streets that still feel governed. In that environment, you can afford the luxury of pretending truth is negotiable, because consequences arrive slowly. A decadent society always produces a philosophy that excuses decadence. That's not a conspiracy. It's biology. People want pleasure without payment, indulgence without accountability, freedom without reality. So a doctrine appears. Truth is relative. And notice the beauty of it, strategically. If truth is relative, then no standard can condemn you. No objective line can say, this is irresponsible, this is destructive, this is cowardly, this is false. Everything becomes valid. Everything becomes a perspective. Everything becomes a narrative. And the people who benefit most are the ones who want to do something questionable while demanding applause for it. Now, to be fair, life does contain complexity. Human perception is limited. Two witnesses can experience the same event differently. Motives can be murky. Context matters. But complexity is not the same thing as relativism. Complexity says, let's investigate carefully. Relativism says, investigation is oppression. That's the pivot. It's the difference between a detective and a propagandist. And if you want to know why this became popular in the modern West, you have to look at the third factor, wealth, and what wealth does to a culture's appetite for confrontation. Closer. Because when a society gets fat, it stops wanting the discomfort of truth and it starts paying for illusions. A rich society is patient with stupidity, not because it admires it, because it doesn't want the trouble. When people are comfortable, they avoid conflict the way they avoid exercise. It feels unnecessary. It feels rude. It feels exhausting. So when a loud minority pushes a convenient lie, the comfortable majority shrugs and says, "Fine. Have it your way. I'm not arguing today." That's how cultural infections spread, quietly, not with a dramatic conquest, but with 1,000 fatigued concessions. Here's the psychological truth. Comfort lowers vigilance. A comfortable person doesn't scan for threats, they scan for convenience. And in the decades where the West felt invincible, when money was cheap, trade was global, and institutions looked permanent, people began to treat reality like a suggestion. But history has a habit of returning uninvited with a bill. And now we arrive at the part no one wants to admit. Comfort is ending. And when comfort ends, relativism stops being cute and starts being lethal. Closer. Because when the environment turns hostile, the only currency that still spends is accuracy. Here's the cold truth. You can't manifest your way out of structural decline. When resources tighten, when the cost of living rises, when stability erodes, when trust collapses, societies don't need slogans, they need clarity. And clarity requires an objective standard. If you cannot agree on what is real, you cannot coordinate. If you cannot coordinate, you cannot respond. If you cannot respond, you lose. That's why denial becomes a national addiction in failing systems. People sense something is wrong. Financial pressure, institutional decay, fragmentation, distrust. But instead of confronting it, they choose soothing language. They don't want truth. They want sedation. And here's where psychology becomes cruel. When reality becomes painful, many people don't seek accuracy. They seek emotional anesthesia. So they double down on narratives. They demand comfort. They punish anyone who interrupts the dream. This is why you'll see hysterics rise as conditions worsen, not because people are getting more evil, because they're getting more afraid. And fear, untamed fear, doesn't produce humility. It produces aggression, which leads to the next chapter, the predator in the street. Because reality doesn't care what your truth is. Closer. You can argue about my truth all day, right until the alligator grabs your leg. Imagine you're walking near a riverbank and you see an alligator moving toward you. You can do 3 things. 1, acknowledge it. 2, ignore it. 3, insist it's a social construct. Only one of those choices keeps you alive. Reality is like that alligator. It doesn't negotiate with your identity. It doesn't debate your narrative. It doesn't wait for your feelings to catch up. It simply advances. And here's the part most people miss. Denial doesn't remove the threat. It removes your ability to respond. A person who tells the truth early is often hated. A person who tells the truth late is called obvious. That is the tax of accuracy. So when you see a culture punishing objective description, when you see "speak your truth" replacing "state the facts," you are watching a society training itself to die slowly. Now, there's a predictable response to this. People say, fine, reality exists. But why does everyone get so extreme? Why does it become censorship, coercion, persecution? Because once denial is threatened, it becomes political. Closer. And that brings us to the next mechanic. When panic meets power, it doesn't ask permission, it demands silence. Censorship isn't born from confidence, it's born from fear. When people truly believe in their position, they debate, they persuade, they tolerate disagreement because they expect to win. But when people feel their worldview slipping, when reality starts cracking through the narrative, they stop debating and start controlling. They don't persecute you because you hurt their feelings. They persecute you because your accuracy threatens their anesthesia. So the more precisely you describe what's happening, the more dangerous you become, not because you're violent, but because you are sobering. And sobriety is intolerable to a culture addicted to denial. This dynamic shows up in every stressed society. The language tightens. The boundaries of permissible speech shrink. The institutions become moralistic and punitive. Public life becomes performative. And the people in charge start confusing obedience with virtue. Now, let's keep this clean and honest. In times of crisis, economic, social, or public health, governments and institutions often use emergency measures. Some are reasonable, some are excessive, and many feel coercive to the people living under them. But here's the point that matters strategically. When an authority demands conformity without allowing questions, it is no longer pursuing truth, it is pursuing control. And control is what panicked systems default to. Now, widen your lens. Because internal panic is one thing, external pressure is another, and the outside world is watching the West with cold eyes. Closer. You think this is just a culture war. It isn't. It's a power shift, and the rest of the world can smell it. Here's the difference between private fantasy and geopolitical reality. The world is not required to agree with your story. Nations do not run on vibes. They run on resources, leverage, logistics, and discipline. And when a civilization begins treating truth like an opinion, it signals something to its competitors: decay. Because the ability to coordinate around reality is one of the foundations of power. Lose that, and everything else becomes performance. Now, I'm not going to pretend I can predict the future with certainty. No serious strategist speaks that way. But I can tell you this: when rival powers see internal fragmentation, institutional distrust, and a culture that punishes objective description, they don't celebrate your progress. They prepare. They become cautious around you, not because they respect you, but because unstable systems behave unpredictably. A wounded empire is still dangerous. That's why competitors manage it carefully, firm enough to advance their interests, careful enough not to trigger reckless reactions. And internally, the worse conditions become, the more the denial class will clamp down, because the fantasy must be protected at any price. Which brings us to the final chapter: what you do with this information. Because understanding the trap is not enough. You must choose a posture. Closer. In the end, you don't win by being angry at the lie. You win by becoming the kind of man truth can't intimidate. Truth is not just an idea. It's a lifestyle. It demands you look at the uncomfortable thing before it becomes catastrophic. It demands you tolerate being disliked. It demands you resist the warm glow of collective delusion. And yes, people will call you cynical. They called the lifeboat cynical too, right up until the ship hit the iceberg. The great 19th century novelists understood this, not because they were prophets, but because they were observers. People don't change as quickly as technology does. The costumes change, the instincts remain. When a society is anxious, it seeks scapegoats. When a society is weak, it seeks censors. When a society is afraid, it seeks comforting lies. And in that atmosphere, my truth becomes the perfect weapon. It lets the anxious feel righteous while they punish accuracy. So what do? You do what any competent man does in hostile territory. 1. You train your eye for reality. Facts, incentives, patterns, outcomes, not slogans. 2. You train your nervous system for discomfort because you will not think clearly if you panic. 3. You learn to speak with precision, not as a crusader, as a strategist. 4. You choose your battles. Not every truth needs to be shouted. Some truths are best deployed at the correct time, to the correct people, in the correct place. And above all, you stop confusing validation with truth. Because there is a final line that separates the men who survive from the men who perish. Reality does not punish you for being wrong. It punishes you for staying wrong. That's the whole truth. And if you can hold it, without hysteria, without bitterness, without needing applause, then you will have something most people don't. A mind that can't be purchased by comfort and can't be frightened out of clarity. And that kind of man is dangerous in the best sense of the word. Okay, thanks once again for watching. Check out the other videos on the channel and I'll catch you on the next one.